Hey, welcome to my channel for woodworkers. Um, it's always been an ambition of mine to start my own woodworking YouTube channel one day, and to basically be able to make my own furniture. In the past, I've tried my hands with many things like building sawhorses, utility shelves, and side tables. But I did so in a pretty haphazard manner without really having the right tools or the right knowledge. I just kind of cobbled things together. And the result of that is I wasn't really happy with the output, and didn't really satisfy me in any major way. Things really changed when I got my table saw. That's when I decided that I wanted to take a more structured approach to building woodworking projects. And I also wanted to share them with people like me, junior woodworkers who are just getting started in the hobby, without the right tools or knowledge, but are simply interested to learn and perfect their skills over time. My intent is to gradually take on more and more creative woodworking projects, and as I acquire the skills, share them onto this channel so that other people like me can learn and follow along the way. The first project that I'd like to share with you is how to build a coffee table. I read online that a good coffee table should be about 2/3 the length of a couch. It should be about 5 to 10 cm below the height of the couch, as in where you sit, so that you don't bump your knees into it, but not so low that it blends into the rug. These measurements should keep the furniture relative in proportion to one another. After measuring it, I determined that it has to be approximately 120 cm long, 60 cm wide, and no taller than 35 cm. Next, I downloaded Shaper 3D onto my iPad to mock up a design, but you can simply use pencil and paper to come up with a simple design that is attractive and yet pragmatic to build. I think that's my first tip. Don't be overly ambitious. For your first build, stick with 90-degree angle for the joints. The key thing to build confidence is to start simple and not be too ambitious with your first project. Next, I went about sourcing materials. Because my city was still in a state of COVID lockdown, options were limited. Basically, I was limited to pine, and even more so, construction grade pine. I wasn't going to let that stop me though. I went online and found some dimensional timber at the local big box store and ended up buying some 100 by 100 squared H4 radiata post that they use for building fences, 50 by 50 squared balusters, which they use to put on the railings along the stairs, and some 120 by 50 pine slats, which I don't know what they're used for, but they can be glued up to make a tabletop. Right, when you're drawing your table, the first step is drawing the tabletop, as that determines the size of your table. So for mine, it was 120 by 60. Next, I added the legs. For the legs, while I was drawing the table, and this is the value in mocking it up before you actually start building, is realizing when the dimensions don't quite work out the way the timber arrives. For me, I decided that the 100 by 100 would look too stocky in proportion to the top. So I took a 45-degree chamfer to the outside edge, so that it looks a little bit more slimmer and it's more in proportion to the overall table. And lastly, I gave it some horizontal supports so that it all hangs together. I forgot to mention earlier that I added a shelf into my design so that I have a space for storing magazines and books that usually clutter the living room. I used 1 cm wide dowels and bought enough so that it could be cut into 16 pieces for this shelf. And this step is entirely optional if you want to keep your design super simple. Next, I started cutting the legs down to size on my table saw. These are really, really heavy. They were probably about 15 kg each. So I use the side table to prop up the sides so that basically I don't drop the wood. I think it's important to mention at this point in time that table saws are one of the most dangerous tools in the shop statistically, because of the exposed spinning blade and the propensity for fingers and whatnot to be injured. So ensure that you have your riving knife installed behind the blade and that you're familiar with its operation. And also with oversized timber, it's quite useful to take a practice pass before you turn on the table saw so that you can gauge how the timber will behave before, during, and after the cut. So these here are the finished pieces, as you can see. These are basically the legs of the table. Next, we've got the horizontal supports, which we're cutting down to size, and then the dowels as well for the shelf. So we've got about 16 pieces all in all. So this here is a mock-up of how it's going to look before we start cleaning up the pieces and putting in the joints. The one slight disadvantage of using construction grade timber is that the pieces don't finish that well. So you actually spend quite a fair bit of time planing and sanding the pieces. As you can see here in this time lapse, all of the edge faces need to be planed down till it's fairly smooth, and I went over it again with sandpaper. Next, I used a table saw to cut grooves into the legs so that they fit together. Ideally, you can use a dado blade to do this, but you can use multiple repeated passes of the table saw to do the same thing. Next part of this video is when you see I'm actually putting the dowels into the shelf, the shelving part of the table. This required drilling parallel holes in the support structure and then threading the dowel through. And what helped was having a rubber mallet to kind of hammer them in because it was quite a tight fit. I also added glue onto these so that they have additional strength for the joints. The next part of this is using a jigsaw to saw off the ends of the dowel, the part that's poking out. The important thing to note here is to leave a little bit of extra space so that you can cut the ends of the dowel down flush with the rest of the shelf, and not to cut too close with the jigsaw. I've done that with a couple of pieces and there are scars to show for it. Well, now that the pieces have been cut to perfection, it's time for the glue up. Just a note that my original CAD design don't have these upper horizontal struts. This is to add more rigidity in case anybody decides to sit on the edge of the table. So we can move on to our next step, which is basically getting the tabletop glued up and set. So let's get the tabletop measured. The reason why I'm fussing over this a little bit here is because it's important to get, first of all, the grain lined up correctly so that it looks the best next to each other. And the other thing is to observe for imperfections in the wood. For example, some pieces are slightly bowed versus others, and it's important to get the curve just right so that later on, when you glue up the boards, you have the minimum imperfections. Right, so that's the sash clamps all set up. Let's get the wood lined up and glued. What's useful to notice here is that I've made pencil markings on how the boards lay, and it's just a matter of simply arranging it the same way, applying glue to the respective four surfaces, and then joining it up. And also just to make sure here that you don't over tighten the sash clamps, you just have to squeeze the glue out and that would be enough, and leave it overnight to dry. Alrighty, looks like the boards have dried pretty well overnight and they're in a pretty good state. But what you've noticed is that some of these boards some parts are a little bit higher than other parts. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go and I'm gonna start marking the boards that have an uneven edge. And typically what I'll do is I'll draw a line along the side that I think is uneven, and the higher side for removal I would just put 2 strokes, kind of like a happy face. So these are the spots that need to be removed. It's not too bad, just a few high spots. This one, there's another one there. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to grab a hand planer and I'm going to start working away at these high spots. Just like that, no more high spots. The next part, as you can see, is that the ends are a little bit uneven, and yeah, there's a little bit of work to do on the sides to get these guys evened up before we can do the finishing. Now that those things are cut off and then sanded down, the next job is to put fill the corners around here and make them nice, the corners nice and round. Actually, a wee trick from primary school, use a protractor, makes life so much easier. The next thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to give the table top a bit of edge detailing, which is I'm going to make the underside chamfered in 45 degrees so that it gives the edge profile a slightly more interesting profile to look at, as well as a slightly thinner visible. So it'll make the table look a bit more slimmer and a little bit more sophisticated. How I'm going to achieve this effect, I'm trying, is to basically flip the table upside down, and I'm going to use an edge router with 45 degree chamfered bit. See that there? And I'm just going to go around the edge of the table, but I'm going to have to flip the table upside down first. So let's So that's the edge profiling coming together quite nicely. The next step is the finishing. So sanding the table down and giving it a few coats of polyurethane glaze. This part was extremely time consuming and I didn't actually shoot any videos of it. But the end result, after about 2 weeks worth of painting, was quite pleasing. So there you have it. This project took the better part of my weekends over November, but the result is something which serves a purpose and looks fairly decent while doing it. Click like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. I can already imagine that my next video will have some examples of how this table is being used in practice, and I'll also get started thinking about my next build. With Christmas around the corner, I'm sure something will come to mind. Take care and happy holidays.